Well, joining us today then on the program is Professor Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Smith. We're going to start this week then with Emmanuel Macron's latest summit on Ukraine. It came and went, though it brought no real diplomatic breakthroughs, the French president acknowledging that not all European allies agree on a proposed force for Ukraine. He made clear, though, that the lack of consensus won't prevent France and Britain from forging ahead with plans to deploy troops to the country in the event of a possible peace deal with Russia. Take a listen.
On ne peut pas dire si les Américains ne se joignaient pas.
We can't say that if the Americans didn't join, we wouldn't do anything. Because that would be like saying that there can be no solid and lasting peace in Europe for Europeans without the Americans. No, that's also why I told you several weeks ago that we are at a decisive moment in our history where we must prepare for a scenario that is not the one we want, where we have to act alone, for ourselves.
So, Professor Smith, Vladimir Putin has really been clear. He's said time and time again that Russia will not ever accept the presence of Western troops on Ukrainian territory as a part of a potential truce agreement. So what exactly is Emmanuel Macron trying to achieve?
Well, this is really, I think, a moment of trying to assert some very clear values, resisting Russian aggression, demonstrating that Europe has strategic autonomy, that it's able to make clear its priorities, and that it doesn't rely on the United States to enforce those. Now, they've had a 3-hour conference that brought together 30 European leaders. This is, I think, the start of at least some moment of putting together a coalition of the willing. It might not be that moment where it's already happening, where it's already put together, but this is certainly something I think it's an important step, which signals some intent. Now, you mentioned there that not all European partners are on board, and of course, we know that Hungary were not present at the summit, of course, very close to Russia and to Putin, and we know that Italy are another country who are, through their leader, Meloni, she's very much sort of, if not openly sympathetic, much more willing to play a sort of duo game, perhaps, and less willing to commit. But that's why I think it's really important that what this summit did is it outlined really quite strongly that France and Britain are going to be the co-pilots on this. They are going to try and find a solution that if the US can't enforce deadlines, if it's dithering, if it's unclear what it's going to do, if, as we've seen only yesterday, there are these sort of different deals going out to Zelensky that are, changing terms and going back on things and all the rest of it, there needs to be some certainty in this and some real reinforcement of the fundamental values that underpin all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Professor Smith, but it just seems like it's a moot point, essentially, to be spending so much time at all of these summits on something that, one of the two major actors in this war have said is not going to happen. So why not focus on something that perhaps is a little bit more attainable?
Well, I think one of the key things is that the war could end tomorrow if Russia ceased its invasion. That's very much the fact of the matter. The idea of that Europe should just kowtow to Russian aggression, I think, is in itself also something which is unthinkable. We can look at what's going on in Germany at the moment with the increasing realization that what this represents really is Russian aggression against NATO, that they see them as a systemic enemy, that this is not something that's going to go away. I think what's very clear when Emmanuel Macron, President Macron, announced an extra 2 billion euros worth of funding to Ukraine, that's funding for missiles, for armoured cars, for all of this kind of stuff. What that says is that there's a realization that this doesn't stop in Ukraine. There's been these ceasefires. Emmanuel Macron mentioned the idea that it seemed that Ukraine had been quite brave in agreeing to this 30-day ceasefire without conditions. But already we've seen, dithering on that. The attacks last night into Ukraine, massive drone attack on Dnipro. These are dangerous times, and Ukraine really faces annexation and obliteration. And I think that's really important, that's the fundamental truth of it, not what President Putin hopes to achieve with this Russian aggression. That's really doesn't matter to an extent. I think if the lessons there are anything, it's that sort of appeasement to that sort of authoritarian leader promises really nothing positive for the future.
We're going to turn to our next story now. That's French prosecutors requesting a 7-year prison sentence for former President Nicolas Sarkozy in his trial on charges of accepting illegal campaign financing in an alleged pact with the late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, now accusing Sarkozy of a frantic quest aimed solely at serving his own personal political ambitions. One of the prosecutors described the case as having painted a very dark picture of the French Republic. So, Professor Smith, back to you then. Do you think that this case is representative of a more generalized integrity issue in French political life that goes beyond Nicolas Sarkozy himself?
Well, I think it's an important element, isn't it? This idea of pursuing corruption. Now, this would be one of the biggest corruption cases in the Fifth Republic. And of course, as you mentioned, let's not forget that Nicolas Sarkozy is there in the courtroom waiting already. An ankle tag, a bracelet from the authorities because of his involvement in the previous Bismuth wiretapping case. Now, this is something that's really important, I think, and it goes right to the heart of trust in politics. And actually, the values that underpin a lot of this. It's really important that France prosecutes to the fullest extent these types of accusations around corruption. Let's not forget, of course, the prosecutors called this a Faustian pact. Now, the devils in question were really those associated with Gaddafi's regime, particularly his brother-in-law. And there's a real suggestion that this was about France sort of going a little bit easy on Gaddafi's brother-in-law, who, let's not forget, was involved in a coordinating role, at least accused of being involved in a coordinating role in, first of all, the Lockerbie bombing, but then also of UTA Flight 772. Now, that involved the death of French citizens. The families were present in the courtroom. So this is, I think, an extraordinary accusation, an extraordinary case. So yes, I think this is something that's really important. I think it's a symbolic case, which really draws a line and is saying that corruption must be pursued to its fullest. But I think this is also an extraordinarily egregious moment of what seems to be really damaging corruption, if it is as the prosecutors allege. Now, of course, we know that Nicolas Sarkozy and his defending teams, his defence lawyers, strenuously deny this. And they are also saying they will be making their arguments really over the next couple of weeks as well, until this 3-month trial comes to an end. So, this is a case that's live, it's in progress, so it's not possible to judge its outcomes. But certainly what the prosecution have alleged at this stage looks like a very damning picture. And we'll wait to see what the defence challenges it with.
Now, finally, an Algerian court has sentenced French-Algerian writer Boualem Sansal, whose case has been at the heart of a diplomatic storm, to 5 years behind bars. France urging Algiers to take humanitarian concerns into account, especially as the 80-year-old Sansal has cancer. But his criticism of Algerian authorities and Islamists as well have made him a target of the regime in recent years, as Emerald Maxwell explains.
I would like to express my full support for Mr. Sansal and his family, and I sincerely hope that, after this judgment, the highest Algerian authorities will take a clear, humane and humanitarian decision so that he can regain his freedom and become a free man again, and be able to treat himself because he is also ill. And I know that I can count on the good sense and humanity of the Algerian authorities to take such a decision. At least I very much hope so.
So, Professor Smith, Sansal is also it looks like a victim of political bickering between France and Algeria then.
Absolutely. This is part of a really challenging moment in Franco-Algerian relations. Of course, just this week, we've had Bruno Retailleau, the Interior Minister, back in his political homelands in the Vendée, speaking out very clearly about the need for France to essentially send back convicted Algerian citizens, including one of those that was involved in a recent terror attack in Mulhouse that left one dead. Now, that's a really important principle at the heart of this. France wants the ability to return convicted criminals back to Algeria, where they hold Algerian citizenship. And what that's brought into to challenge is this idea of immigration laws going back really to Algerian independence, and this idea of preferential treatment. But within the bigger game as well is this idea of the recognition of the sovereignty of Western Sahara. Of course, very clearly, that has irked the Algerian government, France's recognition of Moroccan sovereignty in the Western Sahara. Of course, that was something that Emmanuel Macron did last year, and we saw Rachida Dati, the Minister of Culture, go there in February. This is something that's ongoing and really a very difficult sense. And also there's one last thing, which is that, of course, there is a former finance minister convicted in absentia in Algeria of corruption, who they want to bring back to Algeria, and the French courts are thwarting. So this is really part of a big tissue of difficulties in which it seems really that this author is being kind of caught up within it. He's accused of essentially expressing support for Moroccan sovereignty in a right-wing magazine. But of course, the Algerian court's charging with all this other kind of stuff as well, about conspiracies to pass information and all these kind of things. But it does seem like there is something at the heart of this about free speech and the case of protecting the right of authors, of writers to express themselves. The difficulty is, against the background of interstate relations, that becomes really a very, very, very dangerous territory to walk on.
Now, it may be among the French capital's most beautiful public plazas, to change gears then, but it's also among the most congested. That is the Place de la Concorde in central Paris, located at the bottom of the Champs-Élysées and home to the Luxor obelisk. Well, it's also Mayor Anne Hidalgo's next target in her aim of reducing automobile traffic in the capital. Work on reorganizing the plaza then will soon start. The ultimate objective is to make it a greener, more pedestrianized place. Andrew, I think this is certainly going to make people like taxi drivers in particular even angrier with the mayor of Paris.
It certainly will, but I doubt it will make the taxi drivers repeat the historic role of Place de la Concorde, of course, a site of quite famous executions during the revolution of figures of authority. Instead, throughout the 19th century, it was a place where people gathered. It was, when that Luxor obelisk got put up and the fountains and all the rest of it. It was where the expositions were launched. Of course, most recently, it was the home to places for the Olympic Games. I think it was the BMX and the skateboarding that took place during the Summer Olympics just passed. Now, that's really important because what that did is it showed that there was a role for Place de la Concorde, which didn't involve it essentially being a giant road. What this vision does is essentially transform it and say that actually it should have a role for ordinary people. It takes the kind of pedestrianised from, I think it's 8% to 66%, this design by Philippe Prost and the architects, to make it more green, to make it more retain water, to help reduce surface temperatures because of summer heat waves. It promises really to actually bring it into proper use, instead of just turning the centre of Paris into a car park. So while I think it will be unpopular with the taxi drivers, I think for those people that are actually able to make use of it again, they're actually able to use it as a kind of terrace right down onto the Seine, who are able to gather there, enjoy a little bit more respite during the summer. I think for all those people, for the citizens of Paris, it will be a very welcome thing indeed.
Andrew Smith, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.